All
All right,
right.
take it away.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name's Jordan. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white, cisgender, queer woman living in Chicago. I've been a licensed funeral director for about 5 years now and just recently trained as a end of life doula and working to combine those two things to serve my community here. And I was telling Isabel I'm used to giving this presentation the opposite way of talking to queer and trans people about how to protect themselves when they pass. So it'll be interesting to give it the other way of talking to death care professionals. We're going to start pretty with some pretty basic queer and trans 101 things, just so that we can make sure we're all on the same page. Um, but before we start here, I want to just read this. It's an invitation to brave space by Mickey Jones. Together, we will create brave space because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. This space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together and we will work on it side by side. And I start with that because, unfortunately, when we start to talk about queer and trans people, it tends to get heated. Um, and it is unfortunately turned political. And so I encourage questions, and as long as they're coming with good faith, don't be afraid. If you're not exactly sure of the right terminology, please still ask the question. Um, but I just want to start with the foundation that we're talking about. Queer people are valid and deserve respect. We're also coming from a place that trans people exist, non-binary people exist, and those people are valid and their experience are valid and they deserve respect during their end of life care and after death care as well. Um, so we will start with a little bit of queer and trans 101. So what is transgender, or sometimes shortened to trans? It's an umbrella term describing someone whose gender is different from the sex they were assigned at birth. And just so that we all leave with a little bit better grammar today, it's not transgendered with an ED. It's just transgender. Like Laverne Cox is a transgender woman, or Elliot Page is a trans man. Uh, Pretty simple. It's just that when someone was born, the doctor checked them over and decided that they were one sex, and then later on in their life, they decided that they didn't really jive with that sex, and they might do gender affirming surgeries, they might do hormone therapy, or they might want to change their name and pronouns to better fit what they see for themselves and their gender identity. You might come across people that identify as or use the term transsexual. It's typically an outdated term, but there are people who do identify as transsexual versus transgender. So just be aware of that. And if someone identifies as transsexual, refer to them as such. Cisgender, or cis, is someone who currently identifies as the sex that they were assigned at birth. Cis for short. Cis people also get gender affirming surgeries like breast implants, or those dudes that take steroids to buff up their muscles. Those are also gender affirming surgeries. And despite what some people online or in the news think, cis is not a slur. It's just the opposite of trans. And if we're thinking of gender as a binary. The third topic here, or the third identity is non-binary and genderqueer. Non-binary is used as umbrella term for anyone whose gender identity does not conform to the idea of a gender binary. So if we think of gender as a spectrum with trans here, cis here, they would exist somewhere in between, or they might say, F it, I don't even believe in the binary, and I'm just doing my own thing. And they may or may not also get gender uh, affirming surgeries or treatments, maybe change their pronouns as well. I just wanted to throw this in here just for those who have not, who haven't been exposed to pronouns before. Obviously, we learned in school she, her, he, him. Some people refer to themselves as they, them. And then Z with here, zir is also becoming more popular, but they, them is probably the most popular after he, him, and she, her. Okay. And then queer, which is how I identify. This is used as an umbrella term for people whose gender and sexual identities do not conform to societal norms. So sometimes it's used interchangeably with the acronym LGBTQIA Two-Spirit plus, which is listed out here: lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer or questioning, intersex, asexual, and two-spirit. I, people will always argue about what to include, which letters to include. This is probably the most inclusive that I've come across recently. I also like the term quilt bags. So queer, undecided, intersex, lesbian, trans, bisexual, asexual, gay, and two-spirit. But there's, you will pretty much be safe if you use this acronym. The other thing about queer, some people in the community have a very complicated history or feelings about the word. Some people felt like they are reclaiming it and love using it, like me. And some people still find it very offensive, and it triggers something in them. So if you're not of the community, stay away from using it, I would say, unless the person refers to themselves as queer. Okay, so why even do this presentation? Especially I myself am not trans or non-binary. I found the need for it. I come from a background in my undergrad. I was in the Women and Gender Studies program and just have always been part of that intersectional feminism background activism. And we moved here from Tennessee, and I decided to go to mortuary school. And it was a shock of how non-inclusive they were. People joke that the funeral service is 40 years behind the modern day in terms of like culture and sometimes even technology. And I really did see that, even down to my ethics class was essentially a transphobic like year-long session, which is pretty bad for an ethics class. And it's hard. People who the industry historically is very white, very male. One of those things where the business was passed down from generation to generation of these same people with these same ideas. And obviously you see now how much home funerals have grown, and going outside of the system, more and more women are coming into the industry as like a second career or first career. And also more trans and queer people are coming into it as well. And we have to have a space for them first, and then have an awareness of how to take care of queer and trans people. in their death. So uh, just some statistics here. So 32 trans identified people died violently in the US in 2022. And it's most likely underreported because people are dead named and misgendered in the news reports and in documents, filings. Um, over a course of, I think it was about 20 studies, they found someone compiled all the studies and found that the mortality rate is about 34% to 75% higher for trans people compared to cisgender people, meaning they are more likely to die younger. I think the average mortality rate, I believe, for if you include all trans people of all race background, it was, I think the average life expectancy was about 71 versus 84 for cisgender people. And then when you take into account race and gender, it unfortunately keeps getting lower and lower, with Black transgender women tending to have the lowest mortality rate. And then in a study conducted from 2011 to 2022, over half of trans individuals who passed away, this was in Ohio, were misgendered on their birth certificate. And the co-author of the study, Kimberly Repp, said, people are just poof. Their whole lives, as they have lived them, is switched by one vindictive person. And it should never be that way for anyone. And that's the motto that I live by too. So when we're talking about, what does this have to do with death care, a lot of it comes down to documents and documenting with the government these people's gender identities and how they want to be remembered. And when I'm personally very into genealogy, and sometimes the only things you can find this on somebody is their death certificate, maybe their birth certificate, census information. And if those don't reflect what the person truly was, then we have no way of knowing. And so it's really important that we're able to not only create a space that is inclusive, but also have the government recognize people as they are. So this is a map of the US, obviously, but this is kind of ranking how hard to easy it is to change your name and pronouns with the government. So no shock to anyone, the South here is difficult. And then New York, you'll find that New York, Illinois, and California tend to have the most inclusive and forward-thinking policies. My home state, Tennessee, is the only state where you cannot change your gender identity on your birth certificate, come hell or high water. And then the others are just different mix of bad. Okay, so speaking of documents, I'm just going to go through some of the things that either as a funeral director or maybe as someone who's helping someone through this process, things that you'll come up against. One of them is filling out the death certificate. That's according to the government, that's the most important thing to do when someone dies. That's how the government knows that they're dead. Spoiler alert, it's very frustrating because there's very little information to go off of. Like I said before, it'll vary greatly by which state you're in and which state you were born in. There is no overarching federal law that requires funeral homes, next of kin, or any funeral providers to respect chosen pronouns, names, gender identity, meaning there's no federal law saying you have to use this name for their obituary or their tombstone or any of that stuff. So let's say you are doing a funeral for somebody that you know as Brittany Parker, but you see that their social security card that the family gave you for their social security number has Greg Jones. What do you do? So this is a screenshot from the Illinois vital record system. In Illinois, which is the only one I can speak for, but I'm sure it's very similar in other states, the name has to match exactly with the social security number, or they won't allow you to register the death certificate. I've even had this as an issue with people who were not cis. I had a woman who went by Betty. Her birth certificate said Emily Elizabeth. Her social security number said Betty, uh, Betty Emily, and we had to like go through many combinations to figure out what exactly they were going to take. It has to match exactly with whatever the government says your name is with your social security number. For Illinois, there is the option of putting an alias, which is very helpful in situations where their birth name and their chosen name don't match up. So on the death certificate under name, it'll say, Greg Parker, AKA Brittany Parker or whatever. So check if your state has that as well. So let's say you don't have their information, you're not sure what you're supposed to be putting on their death certificate. Well, you can look at their birth certificate, but here's another roadblock because it varies by state what it takes to alter one's birth certificate with a different name. There are states that require you like some old-timey thing of like making your debut, of making a public announcement of your name change. There's ones that require nothing except for like going to the county clerk and changing it, and then some are in the middle. And then if you have a criminal record, the roadblocks continue to build up in order to change that. So then we go to the sex and gender marker on the birth certificate. For Illinois, there is no gender marker, it's just sex marker. And just as a reference, sex and gender are not necessarily the same things. Gender is how you identify, move throughout the world, and then people assign sex to biology sometimes. It's a larger conversation than that, but we're just going to leave it there. So 31 states allow you to change your gender marker on your birth certificates by simply going to the county clerk. 17 require a court order, and it must be in the state and county that you were born in. However, 25 of the states that allow you to change your gender marker require appropriate treatment, evidence of appropriate treatment, typically meaning either you've gone to counseling for a time or you're taking hormones. Or they require proof of surgery, meaning that you've had those gender affirming surgeries. So add a couple more roadblocks, including just if, like I said, a lot of trans people don't want to take hormones or they don't want to have the surgery. They're still valid as trans people, but not in the eyes of the government. So in Illinois, this is what happens if this is what they say for sex. So you have to put M for male, F for female, U for unknown, or X. And the X is a recent change to Illinois. X meaning you don't, it's kind of the third gender option, or if you're not male or female, you can put X. In other states, there is no X. So you have to put male or female. You could try to go for U for unknown if your family that you're working with doesn't feel comfortable using male or female. Um, so let's say you still aren't sure and you look at you're at their driver's license, and if there are states that allow for non-binary option, like I was saying, and these are these. However, just know that the driver's license gender marker may not match the gender on their birth certificate. So sometimes it's easier to change your driver's license than it is the birth certificate. And just because all of these states allow for an X on the driver's license, very few of them allow it on the death certificate. So like I said, this maybe half of those states allow the gender marker on the birth certificate specifically. And you see the New York, Illinois, California there. And then, so at this time, California, Illinois, and New York are seemingly the only states that allow X as a gender marker on death certificates. I say seemingly because it is insanely hard to find information, A, about like filling out your death certificate, period, and then B, finding out things about, these options, at least through like state and county websites. Almost all the information about, protecting yourself in death, um, like is about legal documents to take care of ahead of time, a will, like all that kind of stuff. It's very hard to find information about these sort of official government things. Illinois was the latest to allow X for the death certificate. New York, it started out as New York City alone, and then the rest of the state was like, essentially was like, this is too complicated, let's just all do it. In California, gender markers on death certificates can be changed after death to respect the person's gender identity, regardless of birth certificate. So in the cases before now, we're talking about doing the original death certificate, if you can put X or female or whatever. If down the line you find out, you need to change a loved one's death certificate to respect their identity, well, hopefully you live in California. So consider all these roadblocks. 11% of trans people are able to change all of their government issue IDs to match their true name and gender. That's insanely low. And so we're talking about driver's license, or state ID, birth certificate, death certificate, divorce decrees, marriage certificates, all the things that we normally get from the county clerk. And the only thing, the passports now allow X as a gender marker, but that's more of a federal thing. So we've gone through the death certificate. You've done your best to figure that out. Now you've going through the actual funeral plans. It's very important to find out who next of kin is, as if you're a funeral director, especially if there's going to be a cremation. You need to find out legally who is in charge of the disposition of this person. You might be familiar with the next of kin order. This is a general one. It can vary slightly by state, but this is kind of the general rule. You'll start with the spouse and biological children. Now, if we're talking about the queer community and trans community, let's say maybe this person got married before they transitioned and their spouse couldn't handle them being trans and they separated, but for whatever reason, they never got a divorce. That person is still in charge of the decedent's disposition and what to do as far as the funeral goes. Same with if they don't have a spouse, if they have any biological children, technically, if there's no document saying otherwise, those kids are still responsible for their disposition. Next is parents and siblings. Um, you know, Parents can be a very tricky subject with any queer and trans person if they're not accepting of you. A lot of times when trans people die young, their parents are maybe not accepting, and that's when you get a lot of misgendering in the news. And then lower priority are these other family members. So this is important because whomever has the right of disposition can exclude any person or group from the funeral related services and can keep anyone from easily finding place of burial and type of disposition. So, uh, I've personally came across this, and when I was doing my apprenticeship, we had a trans young adult whose family was not supportive of that, although she had clearly been living as a trans woman for quite some time. And the friends wanted to be a part of the funeral, but the parents essentially said they are not allowed in the building and have to gracefully acknowledge that because the parents are the ones paying and they're the ones with the right to the disposition. So all of the obituary, all of the signs at the funeral were all with uh, that person's dead name, meaning the name that they don't go by anymore. And the it can be very hard as a friend of someone like that, and you end up having your own private grief because you weren't able to grieve with the community because they weren't respecting this person. I've had friends who were queer and trans who passed away, and same thing. They Parents didn't want anyone involved. Maybe they had a really quick cremation just because they were didn't want to have to deal with people like talking about it or anything, and they can leave off information on the obituary of like where they're buried or if they're cremated, anything like that. And then if they use the wrong name for the grave marker, that makes it even harder to find this person too. So this is a quote from ANELDA, which is the End of Life Doula Association that I trained with. So in a situation where someone is misidentified by their funeral presentation, grave marker, or obituary, the grief is compounded by these harms towards the LGBTQIA 2S plus community as a whole. This has a cascading effect, causing fewer trans people to trust their end of life care to anyone other than their chosen family and loved ones. Um, you know, People tend to be uh, not paranoid, but mistrusting of funeral directors in the first place. In a lot of communities, they think that they're out for your money, which is true in some cases. But then when you see a loved one being treated disrespectfully, it doesn't cause you to trust those funeral directors anymore. That's why it's important as a end of life doula, as someone who does home funerals, you're offering this choice outside of the system uh, to respect people. Um, So these are just some, I Googled dead naming, and these are kind of the first cases that came up. And like I said, dead naming is when you call someone the name that they don't go by anymore. Um, and so I came across a case in Australia where a trans teen committed suicide, and the parents were talking about the arrangements, and the mom was respectful of the teen being trans. The father was not. And so the father continued to use their dead name. And so they ended up having two separate funerals because since both parents were in charge of responsible for the disposition equally, they just did two completely separate funerals. Um, Good old Twitter removed their policy against dead naming transgender people, which leads, just continues misinformation, and it's just harmful. So there's this pretty recent news article about a teen in Ireland, Brianna Gay, who was violently murdered by some fellow teens. And in articles, they they named her as just a teenage girl, and used her name. And then once they found out that she was trans, they changed it to a transgender teenager, and in some cases used her dead name as well. And like I said before, just think about being a friend of this person and seeing them disrespected even after they've passed away. It like just hurts my heart. And then on a if you're into true crime, this might, you might have thought of this. So this is in 2019. At least 20 trans people have been murdered this year so far, and police keep making the same mistake while investigating them. They don't acknowledge that they might have been living under a different name. And when you're conducting an investigation, you need to go, you can't go up to someone and be like, hey, did you know Mike, when this person's never known this person as Mike, they've known them as Natasha. So there's some really good information out there regarding that aspect of it too. Okay, so other possible situations for being misgendered. If you die of an unnatural cause, you might have an autopsy. So this also depends on state and county. In Cook County, where I live, if they can't determine easily a cause of death at the scene, you are taken and you either get a external exam at the Cook County Medical Examiner, or they do a full autopsy uh, with toxicology. So if you have not had the surgery, meaning surgery on your genitalia, you may be marked as the wrong gender on official paperwork. And if you think about someone who doesn't have family, or maybe they were indigent, they might not even have had a driver's license showing a gender that they identified with. All you have is, all the coroner has to go off of is what they see and what they determine when they get your body. Hospitals, ERs, hospice, and other healthcare settings. This is hard because, a lot of where I live, there's a lot of hospice that are also affiliated with religious organizations, and ones that aren't necessarily kosher with trans things. And I the funeral home I worked at until recently is in a very Catholic town, and they have great hospice places, but they are run by a Catholic affiliated organization. And either if even with a gay person, they would still say in a hush hush voice, like, oh, that was Dave's friend. And you have to feel out if they mean friend or, their actual partner. Um, and with it's just, I'm sure if you're queer trans, like the awkwardness sometimes, and people are trying to beat around the bush and not necessarily outright include you or outright exclude you. Um, and that varies tremendously by the area that you are in and the organization you go to. So it's really important to feel that out beforehand. I mentioned earlier obituary. It's kind of it. I'm a broken record at this point. It will vary depending on where you live. I the town that I worked in, families could send in their own obituary if they wanted, but the newspaper will call the funeral home and double check that they actually like went through you, or so, and if they did, they can tell them like, well, what do you have on their death certificate, what name? And we give them the name, and then they tell the family like, no, you can't use a different name for this obituary. Because technically anyone can submit an obituary. I think in the Chicago Tribune they don't do that, they don't verify, but it's worth checking out if you plan on sending an obituary through a newspaper. um, Same thing with funeral homes. Like every funeral home now has obituaries on their website. Well, if someone who is not supportive of the trans decedent does the obituary, then it's not going to be correct. Same thing with headstones. There's a pretty famous article that was circulating around recently about this woman. I think her name was Debbie May, and she was a veteran. She was a trans woman. And if you're not aware, if you are a veteran, you get a free burial in a national cemetery, and they'll put your name on it, and your rank, and if you were in the war, whatever war you were in. So before she died, she went to go fill out all of the paperwork with the National Cemetery using her current name, and they refused to let her use it. And so she fought literally until the day she died to get her name, Debbie May, put on her headstone. And it ended up that they still used her dead name after she passed. And I just think like, you know, there are people that will never know that that is where she is buried because they didn't identify her correctly. Also, with the news article I mentioned before, with the dad who was dead naming his daughter, those parents fought over the headstone as well, because they both technically have the right to what to put on it. So the mom wanted to put like, she wanted obviously to have their new name, and she was willing to compromise and have their dead name and then their new name underneath, but the dad wouldn't budge. And so I don't know, I haven't checked recently, but I don't think she has a headstone still. And which is effed up because depending on the cemetery, you can get away with putting a lot of nicknamey stuff on your headstone. Like usually it can't be anything like crazy, but you know, people put like Grandma Bubbles McGee, like rest in peace, like just like stuff like that. But anyways, and then obviously, as we've been talking this whole time, unaccepting family, funeral professionals, and clergy. I can tell you another time, I was working for a removal service as a funeral director, and I did a removal at an apartment building, and a lot of the person's friends were there, and clearly I was going to pick up a woman. They called her, I can't remember what her name was, but everyone was calling her the same name, all this stuff. You could tell by her apartment she was living as a woman. And I noticed as I was doing the removal that she had genitalia you would normally associate with men. So I still put her name on the information, took her to the funeral director that would be embalming her, and was helping him get her onto the table. And he was like, "Oh, you said its name was, you know, whatever female name." And I was like, "Yeah, that's her name." And he was like, "But," and was just like, it looked like his brain had left his body. And I was like, "This is her. She's a woman. This is her name." And I pretty much just left him still like just scratching his head. So I don't know what came of that case, but I can't imagine it was good. And then obviously clergy, depending on the religious organization. Like I said, I live in an area that is heavily colored by the Catholic Church, and I grew up Southern Baptist, so those are the ones I'm most familiar with. And I can confidently tell you that neither one is accepting of trans people. But other ones are more, and it can vary by region too. Um, and let's see. Okay, so this is all a big bummer, you guys, but what can we do about it? Turns out there's a lot you can do. The first thing, if you know people who are trans or queer or non-binary, planning and planning and planning and planning and planning some more. Um, I would definitely take a screenshot of this or write down at least this link right here. This is insanely helpful and breaks down by state as much information is known about what forms you need to have someone take care of your after death care. So wills are obviously the most popular death document. They're not completely binding. They have to have certain certification for them to be legally binding. And I know we all know someone, grandma, who like wrote down what she wanted on a piece of paper like in 1960 and never got it like certified. So technically that would not hold up in court. There's a living will that this contains lots of medical care things, but importantly, the DNR, the do not resuscitate order. There's a medical power of attorney that allows you to appoint a person to make medical decisions on your behalf. It does not include anything regarding funeral decisions like cremation or burial, all those things, unless it specifically says so. I know that a lot of hospices use, I think it's called the 5 questions or it's something, the 5 whatever, but it's like this really easy to read like worksheet that goes through a bunch of different medical situations and how you want those to be handled. And but it also asks, how do you want to be remembered? What do you want done with your body, essentially? So this is my favorite, the appointment of agent to control disposition of remains. This is the best legal protection for protecting your identity. Allows you to appoint a trusted person as your quote unquote funeral agent and take control of all after death care. That would also include taking care of the finances. But this is one of those more like rock solid things where if, let's say, my partner passes away, but I don't have any, I'm not next to kin, we're not married, and their mom wants to have them buried in a Catholic cemetery, and I know for sure they would not want that. Well, if I have this saying that I'm their funeral agent, I can fight this in court. And I have more ground to stand on. And I can tell you, a lot of funeral directors do not want to get involved in lawsuits and all of that. It's a big pain in the butt. And they'll usually, well, I can't say usually, but they might, be on your side if you have the legal documentation. And then obviously creating inclusivity, not only in your professional life, but in your private life as well. Always advocating for marginalized voices, and educating yourself on marginalized voices. We all come from a different spectrum of privilege, and we all have things that we can learn more about and be more inclusive of. And then use chosen pronouns of the person and their name, even when others do not. I should have put an asterisk beside this. The only time when I wouldn't do that is if this person was not out, meaning that they their family doesn't know that they're trans or know that they're gay or whatever. Like, don't out them to somebody. But if their aunt comes to the funeral and she's calling them Joe and their name's Kate, continue to say Kate, continue to say she, like I did with the funeral director who couldn't figure out what was going on. And it can be hard. I've been in situations like where I've been in a very traditional arrangements room with an upper class family who their teenager committed suicide and was trans, but the family didn't would continue to use her dead name and dead pronouns. Dead pronouns. I don't think that's a thing, but misgendering her, and it can be hard. And these people are grieving their 14-year-old daughter who passed away violently and unexpectedly. So I tapped into my like Southern upbringing and got didn't I avoided using sentences that needed pronouns or needed her name as best as I could. And then if when people called about the services, um, depending on who it was, I would, use her name and all of that. But it can be hard, and as an employee who, these people are paying you, it gets awkward, but you have to get comfortable, at least get comfortable with sharing your own pronouns, which I've added here too. Um, like even in the Zoom chat, like putting your pronouns in it, and in your email signature, having your pronouns there. If your funeral home has a biography of everybody, make a point of putting your pronouns there as well. This signals to people that you are an inclusive person or a safe person to be around. Um, and does your workplace have a gender neutral bathroom? This one's kind of harder to change, but I would say if you are working maybe in like hospice situations or like in with like a death doula, maybe getting familiar with which hospitals and hospices have gender neutral bathrooms. And so you can let your clients know at least. And like, if you're a funeral director, like knowing which churches and like banquet halls and stuff have gender neutral bathrooms as well. A big one that is hard for people, I think, is reining in your curiosity. And this goes for your personal life too. Like when you find out somebody's trans and you're not, familiar with it, it's normal to have questions and like be like, well, how does this work? Or like, what happened with this? But it's not their job to educate you, and the internet is free. And you can always, there's a plethora of information out there to educate yourself. Um, Make a habit of sharing your own pronouns, like I said, and also asking people theirs. Some people might feel weird and not answer, but some people will tell you their pronouns, and that just make it like a non-issue. Even if you think someone's cis or whatever, like still ask their pronouns. Like I said earlier, never disclose someone's identity to others without their consent. This can become a huge safety issue. So if you're working with someone who's trans, ask them how you should refer to them with their family or with their doctor or whoever. And then research trans supportive agencies in your area, including inclusive healthcare and funeral homes. I know as I start my work as a death doula, I'm trying to find places that I know are going to be safe for trans people and their families. And not just in name either, like try to get a vibe of the people and like ask if they've taken care of trans people before, and what kind of policies do they have, speaking mainly to funeral homes. And as much as you can, try to educate on those legal documents, because unfortunately that's what quote unquote matters the most, is legally how is this person defined and how are they defined in the eyes of the government. This is a great thing from Skipping Stone. They have a lot of good information about that's accessible to like teenagers, but it's about queer and trans things. So check your own assumptions. Ask. You can never know or tell someone's name or pronoun just by looking at them or by the sound of their voice. Never ever assume someone's pronouns. Uh, my partners and I have gotten into the habit of using they until we know for sure someone's pronouns. And it does change how you think about things. And even just that practice, it's reinforcing that you're not assuming that this person's a woman or a man or whatever. Um, if you're ever unsure or even maybe forgot, there's never any harm in asking again. I think it's this is me forever. I will ask someone's name and they will tell me, and then 10 seconds later, I have forgotten their name. And so I'm constantly asking, and I've gotten to the habit of asking for pronouns too. It can feel like dumb and embarrassing in the moment, but it's so much better to ask than to misgender someone. If someone tells us their name, pronouns, or something about their gender, it's our job to use and respect them. If we need help, we can always ask others to help us with our learning and point out when we've made a mistake. And, try to find vetted resources online, obviously, and don't don't expect one trans person to be the monolith of the whole trans community, and seek out different points of view. A white trans man's experience is most likely going to be very different than, say, a Black trans woman. And just like cisgender people's experiences vary greatly on their other identities, same with trans people. And then practice. For some of us, things like using a different name for people or asking for pronouns is new and can be tricky. Changing our words and actions takes time and effort. Keep working at it and it will pay off. It can be hard. I mean, this is not just for the business side of it, but for personal too. Like, it can be hard to switch names when you've gotten used to referring as someone as a different name. One of my partners transitioned mid-relationship, and it was a learning curve, but it's just at some point when you continue to practice and when you mess up, don't make it about you, just say I'm sorry and then do the right thing, and you'll get to the point where it's natural. Like I said, we always say they now instead of she or her, or she or him, and it's good practice, honestly. And that is it. So I guess I'll turn it back over to Isabel.
Thank you so much. This was great. So if anybody has any questions, if you could put them in the chat. We did have two helpful call-ins from Kay and Judy, recommending an alternative to committed suicide as saying either died by suicide or suicided.
Sure.
Yep. And if anybody else has questions, you are free to either raise your hand or submit those questions in the chat, and I will feed them to Jordan.
5 wishes. Thank you for that. That was
Yeah.
what I meant. I knew it was a noun.
Totally. So, Jordan, do you have, I mean, I know from a sort of professional funeral director standpoint, it is obviously tricky figuring out how to navigate the family dynamics of who is your actual client and if they're misgendering, the decedent. Is there advice on navigating that dynamic for people who are perhaps helping, on a more freelance basis where you might not have that kind of super structure, you know what I mean? Of, I'm worried I'm going to lose my job if I actually honor this
Right.
person, right? Because obviously there's tension there when you have family members who are not honoring their decedent's wishes.
Right. So it there's no right answer.
Right.
I think for myself, so one example is as a end of life doula, I'm not necessarily going to be involved in any documentation for the government or anything. I just know this person as who they are. And if, like you said, if family is misgendering them and things, I think in that situation, I would have to let them know what they're doing is disrespectful, and try to educate them like a little bit. And then if, because sometimes it's out of ignorance or not knowing exactly what to do and being embarrassed to ask. And if they still don't correct the behavior, um I just let them know that it's not acceptable, and I continue to do what I think is right, which is not misgendering them and using their chosen name. And you kind of have to feel that out in your business. Like if people are going to be irate with you doing that, sometimes it's better just to do what you can and leave. You can give information to whatever funeral home is going to be taking care of them and say, hey, just so you know, this is how they identify, um, and be aware that the family doesn't is not supportive. Or like if you know that they're going to be going into a hospice, like giving them a heads up. I think that's what I would feel comfortable with, and I would feel like I could, like, not to be dramatic, but like I could sleep at night knowing that it at least
Mhm.
did that. um and trying to make sure that these people do have supportive people in their life, because you can't take on all of their burden. But you came to do a specific thing, and if they have, make sure that they have friends or someone else in their community that is willing to continue to uh, respect them and try to like fight for them, basically.
Mhm. For some of those policies that you mentioned, are there ways for people who want to help do advocacy around trying to codify things like, allowing a different gender on your birth certificate or death certificate or driver's license? Um, are there like groups or organizations that you may know of that help to do that kind of legal, like state level legal advocacy?
Yeah, so a lot of organizations, put effort towards it, but I would say like the Trans Equality Project is one. HRC is like a really mainstream one. But even since everything is not cohesive, working on a state level is honestly more important. Um, And that's like when we think about what just happened in Tennessee with the drag queen bans and all of that, like it's really the local organizations that made a difference in doing that. So I would check first at your state level, for equality organizations, and then go like more national. Because I don't foresee a national rule being put in place anytime soon, honestly. So
Mhm. Christina mentioned in the chat that there's a group in St. Louis called Metro Trans Umbrella Group that's very helpful as well,
nice.
towards that end. And if anyone else has any suggestions for local groups, definitely feel free to put that in the chat as well. Does anyone have any other questions? Because otherwise, I might ask you, Leilani, to mention our board that is looking for new members, but want to give people the opportunity to ask questions once more.
Well, before I get to announcement, I make a comment real quick. And just to say that this is so different for everybody. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Jordan, for your knowledge and sharing this time and space with us today. And to other folks, I'm Leilani. I'm also on the board with Isabel. And as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking about how wildly different it is for everyone. And it made me think of and I bring this up often, if anybody on the webinars read Stone Butch Blues, by Leslie Feinberg, in the scene in the funeral where the family is so unsupportive of their queer, child. And they said, if you, all these like butch lesbians, they said, if you come to the funeral, you better dress like a woman, or you have to, or the family's going to kick us out. And how the main character showed up, was like, I'm not doing that, I'm not putting a dress on, and showed up, and they shut the funeral down, kicked everyone out. And it's like, I always think of that when I hear about how badly it can go. And so just planning ahead, and also just, it's just so important, but also just knowing that it doesn't, sometimes you can do all the work to plan ahead and your family just sucks of origin, right? Like, and to just know that yes, we should do all this stuff, but like, I can't imagine my family's going to act cool at my funeral myself, right? So they're just going to be rude and use wrong pronouns, and so it goes. So not to dismiss all the work we need to put into this, but but I just want to say that it's just from my experience. I think that I think it's all important in planning. Like, I hear you, the planning ahead is like number one, but also, and not to be defeatist about it, but just prepare that some people are just homophobic and transphobic assholes.
Well, I think the point is make sure they're not the ones in charge of your disposition, or whatever, right?
Yes, but just know that it still will pop up, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, it's hard not to be doom and gloom about it, especially when the laws are against you in so many cases. I think this is where I would advertise or market for a death doula, because they can be so helpful. And even if, let's say, I pass away and my family doesn't respect me or whatever, my friends can still work with the death doula to create some sort of ceremony that's like, it might not include my body, but a ceremony to help express grief, and like all the things that funerals are so good for can still be done. It's just working around the system, and death doulas and people who advocate for home funerals are really good at working around the traditional system too. So Leilani, that was a really good point.
Cool. Well, if you don't have any other questions, if you're new to the National Home Funeral Alliance, I didn't announce this at the beginning, but we are an organization that does education around home funerals and community death care. And we are currently looking for new board members. So Leilani, I'll let you maybe give a little.
Yeah, and if you don't mind putting in the chat, I was actually like frantically searching for the link to the application.
Oh, yeah, I can do that. Yeah, for sure.
So I'll just do the spiel real quick. Thank you so much, everyone, who joined us today. We hope to see you again at this ongoing series. Apologize, it's dark on this end. I live in Honolulu. It's so hot. I just don't even want to turn my light on. So sorry if I look like I'm creeping on y'all. But we, all the stuff that the National Home Funeral Alliance does is like a labor of love. We have wonderful volunteers. We're a volunteer board, and I see Tula's here, who did our first talk of the series and has also volunteered helping us put out the guidebook that maybe y'all have seen. So we have wonderful volunteers. But another way to volunteer is to join the board. And the reason we're pushing so hard is that 4 of us, our 3 years on the board is up in October. And so we're trying to plan ahead and get new members in so we can have a smooth transition. Serving on the board of the National Home Funeral Alliance for almost 3 years now has been one of my most favorite volunteer opportunities of my life. A wonderful group of folks on the board and also members, all coming together for the purpose of, telling everybody what's up with home funerals and educating and advocating for them to make them more accessible to everyone. If that sounds like something you want to spend some time doing, please apply. Isabel put the form to apply in the chat. We are currently accepting applications and going to interview folks in the next few months. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask here or reach out to me and Isabel. But super rewarding volunteer experience, I feel like. And we need more folks. So thank you.
Yeah, come join us. I put both my email and Leilani's email in the chat also for anybody who wants to reach out and ask questions about it if you do have any questions. Otherwise, I think we're good. Thank you everyone for showing up. This has been great. Thank you so much, Jordan.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yep.